and he filled it with curiosities and antiques, so many and so mysterious, that it became a sort of reliquary, like that of John Zaffas or Ed Warren. Together, the creaky old house and its collection of antiquities and curios were probably unmatched anywhere. His collection included 17th and 18th century harpsichords, dueling pistols, Mongol daggers, and old gaming boards. From the Civil War, there were collections of letters from long-dead soldiers, buttons and wicked-looking bayonets, vast amounts of pottery. Perhaps most ominous, and sometimes dubious, was his small collection of Egyptian artifacts, said to be from the Valley of the Dead. He bought the house when I was 10. It was on a tree-lined street on the farthest outskirts of Chicago. It had been long abandoned by then. On the overgrown acreage, it looked like a tall, aging spinster that had somehow defied death, just barely on the edge of dignity. It was faded, wrinkled, and ragged. Dad found tin-type photographs of his house somewhere, where it sat alone, no other homes in sight. It was on a dirt road, with a few elm trees dotting the monochrome land around it. It looked like it belonged in a historic collection somewhere, along with photos of Lincoln and Grant and soldiers littering the gray fields of Gettysburg. Yes, it was abandoned and broken, but my father was as fearless as he was in love with artifacts and architecture. To add to the Hollywood creep factor, the house was built upon ground once populated by Native American Potawatomi, Miami, and Illinois tribes. The massive oak trees on the grounds were well over 100 years old. Just a few blocks away, one of the oldest oak trees in Illinois still stood, famous for the Indian leaders that were said to gather beneath it. That could not be good. But Dad probably imagined the voices from its former occupants walking the same narrow, creaky wooden floors, speaking of Civil War battles and of life long past. He knew there had to be the whispering of slaves hiding within this same house, in basement tunnels and secret rooms, in their stop on the Underground Railroad. And Dad loved trains. One of his distant uncles had ridden the rails as a hobo. I have his watch. The house had survived the Great Chicago Fire, being so distant and alone. But my father's insatiable interest in architecture came from painting the great mansions of the barons and tycoons that rebuilt the city. When their opulent castles began to crumble to urban blight, my father would reclaim what he could from among the skeletons and rubble. And many of these items, like fireplace mantels, inlaid wooden trim, and plaques, were to be a part of his collection within the Prospect House. See what I mean? Native Americans, opportunist barons and slaves, artifacts from Egyptian tombs, war relics, and other curiosities. We should have known. Although my father loved it, the house didn't look all that great to my siblings and me. We'd been hoping for a Brady Bunch kind of place, a split-level, mid-century modern suburban one, with rust-colored shag carpeting and olive-green new appliances. What child cares about the wonders of the lathe and plaster and of 14-foot ceilings? Yes, our new house looked pretty much like a place that could be silhouetted on a Halloween poster, even if the location scouts didn't see it. Besides its size and history, the price was right, and we were a family of 7. Like all good haunted house stories, this one was priced so low that Dad could not resist. Hello? It was filled with leaves and dust and broken glass and rotting wire fixtures. The yard was overgrown with weeds. Layers of paint, decades old, were peeling from the exterior walls. Shingles were missing from the roof, and some of the tall windows broken. Pipes were cracked, and there was no water. The massive boiler in the basement didn't work. None of these obstacles bothered my parents one bit. And so my siblings and I explored why the handyman and contractors finished the minimum work so we could move in. I bet they thought it was creepy too. When we moved in, it was decided we would share bedrooms. That was fine, since no one wanted to sleep in one of the high ceiling rooms by themselves. It wasn't long before we learned the house was as haunted as it looked. We didn't talk about it much, but we all felt it, and we all knew it. There were constant noises in the walls, scratching, thumping, bumping. There were often footsteps overhead. "They're just animals, probably raccoons," my father would tell us. "They get inside the walls and they're hard to get out. It's normal in these old places." "Sure, Dad." There was always a collection of mysterious noises past the ceiling coming from the attic. The attic was an entire third floor, a high-ceilinged space that contained numerous secret rooms and passages outside its inner walls, hiding places of the Underground Railroad. An unusually broad, tall window in the attic could be opened, and the roof could be traversed in the night to conceal the rooftop rooms under the gables. None of us, even as adults, would ever be brave enough to explore those hidden areas of the attic. Everyone was afraid of the attic. It didn't matter if you were 10 years old or 30. It was frightening. Anyone who ventured up the unfinished stairs would feel the presence, as if someone else was living up there and you were uninvited. Until the day the house was sold. That never changed. No one wanted to be alone in that house either, especially at night. Besides the odd noises, there were whispers, words, sometimes just beyond the edge of recognition. There were many times when I heard someone speaking to me, whispering, "John," from over my shoulder. Eventually, I ignored it. It was one of those things that you could get used to if you weren't alone. And in the 70s and 80s, we filled the house with all kinds of activity: cats, dogs, friends, and neighbors. We had a green parrot who constantly squawked. There was music from pianos and harpsichords and record players. In the chaos, the ghosts were probably overwhelmed. But at night, in the silence and darkness, they would return. As I learned more about hauntings, I realized that what we often accepted as normal was anything but normal. Doors would open by themselves so often that we just ignored it. Items would disappear as if lost: keys, books, coins, and clothes. We accepted it as just another loss among the chaos: shoes, baseball bats, and Barbies. But then we'd find them, days or even years later, in the attic, or on the floor of some closet, or right where we'd left them. We didn't know what cold spots were then either, but they were there, in the attic, in the basement, and just passing through a room. We ignored the cold spots too. The old house had just too many excuses. Over time, our fear of the basement and attic grew profound. We'd run up or down the stairs, get what we needed, and run back. We knew. Once, when we took a flashlight into the far corner of that basement, we found a collection of sticks and rocks and canned food next to the old coal chute, carefully arranged. It was terrifying to think of someone or something alone in the darkness, arranging those things. Sometimes, we'd think someone was living in our basement, in the dark, and we would often joke that the unfinished coach house behind the house also had someone hiding in residence. At least that would explain some of the creep factor. My dad knew more than he let on. We came to learn that the house was known, through some anecdotal or historical account, to be haunted. Visiting with my father in early 2000, he told me that he had been contacted by someone writing a book about America's most haunted places. He said they had asked permission to take photographs of our attic, basement, and coach house. He said he turned them down. But he never did say how those writers had come to know what we did. Until I went to college, I didn't realize how nice it was to feel safe when going to sleep, or to be alone at a home. Because growing up in that old Victorian house, fear was always only a few rooms away. When my father passed away a few years ago, the estate needed to be sold. So I bravely moved in, by myself, to begin packing. After a single night of unexplainable noises and whispers, I moved into a tiny bedroom in what we called the servants' quarters. At night, I locked the bedroom door. I had forgotten what it was to be afraid of a house. But when I came back alone, the house decided to remind me. Day and night, the house tried to scare me. Doors would slam with angry force. On more than one night, I awoke to the slamming of cabinets in the kitchen, banging over and over. Even in the daylight, it kept up. There were sharp, loud smashing sounds in certain rooms. Noise like an entire china cabinet had toppled. Or that a stack of ceramic tiles had been dropped from the ceiling. I'd rush into the room, and everything would be normal. Of course. At times like that, I'd call my sister. "They're at it again. It's so annoying." "Seriously? Just tell them to stop," she'd say. Some nights, there would be a persistent knocking on the bedroom ceiling, which wasn't even below the attic, but rather beneath the hidden rooms on the roof. I'd pop in my earbuds to listen to music, ignoring them. But the whispering voices, they were the worst. Just when I'd forgotten about all the creepiness and simply opened a door, the voices would whisper. Not just one voice, but many. It wasn't the swoosh of wind or a creaky hinge, but actual, whispered voices. Though indiscernible, they sounded like a faint audio track of 10 people whispering at once. On a few especially bad nights, I almost dialed 911. Both times, the attic sounded like it was hosting a deathmatch event. There were crashes and muted voices, loud bangs and thuds that sounded like people were wrestling, and it would go on and on. Once I stood at the bottom of the attic stairs and recorded the sounds. My sister and I decided that it was simply impossible, that a fight was really happening in the attic. So I would shout up to them from the steps, demanding they stop, and they did. But it was always something. Like when I stepped out the back door to get something from my car, only to find the back door had been locked with a key from the inside. I stood there in the freezing winter air, cursing at them and wishing I was back in my safe apartment in Florida. On the last day before we moved out, my sister and I stood at the top of the front stairs. She suddenly turned her head and asked me, "Did you change the tune of the doorbell?" "What? Why would I do that? And I don't even think that's possible." "Shh. Did you hear that?" she whispered. "It It's a piano. I didn't hear anything. After a while, we resumed packing the box. A few minutes later, I heard it. Someone was clearly playing a piano downstairs. My sister and I knew there were no pianos in the house. They had long been moved. I couldn't wait to pack that last box and leave. When we finally walked out the door for the last time, we both wondered what stories the new owners would have to tell. And here's a story from Chris in Washington. Haunted Pizzeria. I work in a haunted pizzeria. It's located in the oldest part of the city where I live, in a building that's working toward its second century of existence. During the course of that time, this building has served many functions: immigrant community center, hotel, and now dining establishment. It qualifies for the descriptor haunted by virtue of local lore about a haunting by a woman who worked as an escort during the hotel period of the building. During this, she was supposedly murdered. I've been employed at this business for over a year as a cook. Our walk-in cooler is located in the basement, considered to be the most haunted area. While coworkers have claimed to have experiences there, I have not. I access the area frequently on a daily basis. I've never had anything weird happen. However, I did experience a little event in the prep kitchen. I need to preface this by saying that I had never seen a ghost up until that point. I was chopping away at bell peppers, a task that entails chopping a case of bell peppers into thin strips. This was a time-consuming and repetitive task. As I was engaged with it, I perceived a person standing to my left, approximately 10 feet away from my left shoulder. The entrance to the prep kitchen is a swinging door. The door swings back and forth for several rotations after a person enters or exits, and I saw this person standing to my left inside the prep kitchen, yet the door was still. The person was a few inches taller than me, had big curly hair, and was wearing an apron with the neck loop over the head. This entity seemed to be a male. As I continued cutting peppers, with this person standing to my left, each time I turned my head to see them, he would vanish. I saw this apparition for months. I attempted to debunk it with pattern recognition theory. After accepting a modest promotion, my apprehension or whatever of this figure mostly subsided. I still occasionally perceive it, however. So I decided to poke around for a little more information on the business. And information like that isn't available online, but one of the staff had been working there for 28 years. And when I asked him if there had been any deaths during his time there, he answered, heck yeah. Apparently, there had been some overdose victims in the 1990s.
Hi, Lex. This is Ben from North Carolina. This is a story that happened about 13 years ago when I first moved in to an apartment where my girlfriend lived. We've been married 12 years now, and we still talk about this all the time. Hard to say if it's a ghost story or not. We just know that it happened. And so the apartment was a carriage house. It was sort of built over a garage behind another house in sort of the old district of Wilmington, North Carolina, sort of very old building. And my wife, my girlfriend at the time, and her best friend who lived together, I noticed when they moved into this apartment together, their relationship became pretty stressed. Obviously, there's a lot of reasons that could have happened. Some some people get along better when there's some space between them. This wasn't the biggest apartment. I certainly think maybe me moving in there may have caused some stress. We had a dog. She had a cat. They fought like cats and dogs. That might have been an issue. But then things changed. There was the way the small house was set up. The bottom floor was an open garage. The apartment was on the second floor, and there was a crawl space in the attic. And there was a vertical shaft that went from the garage up to the attic, and there was sort of a porthole, looked like a dumbwaiter door, and you could open the door, and there was a ladder in there. And I think I might have opened that sort of porthole door and looked up maybe once, maybe twice, but it was, I'm not overly superstitious or anything like that, but I didn't like it. I can say that I did not like it. And we noticed, it was an eerie feeling, just looking at that sort of, it's an untraditional, non-traditional kind of thing to see in the apartment. Just this like weird panel that would just lead up and down. And at one point I remember we had I think it was a cable repair guy came, and he took one look at that and realized that that's possibly where the cable wiring was, and he refused to go in there and left, which, struck us as odd. And, and again, things just got weirder and more tense. Even during the day, it was very uncomfortable to be around the ladder in the garage area. If you parked in the garage and got out of your car, the ladder was right there, and then sort of disappeared up into this tube that went up to the second floor and into the attic. It's just very unnerving to be around it. Hard to explain other than to say it was unnerving. Part of the reason we were stressed out at the time was that near the apartment were some train tracks. And because it's easier to get trains through residential areas at night, it's obviously less traffic. The trains would roll through at 3 or 4 in the morning and blow their horns really, I don't know what that was. That was creepy. At really high volume and irregular patterns, so you couldn't even sort of habituate to it. It would just wake you up. So, again, maybe lack of sleep, maybe stress from too many people in a small apartment. My girlfriend and I we certainly squabbled, but we tried to stay cool. But my girlfriend and her best friend fought like they had never fought. They had been best friends for some time, and their relationship was really just on the rocks. And I think what was creepy about it was that they didn't know why. They would have fights, and then afterwards, not so much make up as just not know why they had been so angry, and that was certainly unnerving. Then things took another turn and started getting a little more physical and severe. I don't remember exactly the first thing that happened, but there were just little things. Keys would move around. We wouldn't be able to find our car keys, or my shoes would move from the porch to another part of the house. But there was one night where something struck the window and knocked the sort of decorative mirror we had on the wall off the wall onto the ground with a lot of force. I actually thought it was a bullet at first. It wasn't the best neighborhood, so it wasn't out of the question. And my girlfriend and I were both shocked and sprung out of bed and had a hard time going back to sleep after that. And this culminated... we'd been there a couple months. It hadn't been long. We woke up at the same time screaming. Casey, my girlfriend, and I both just screaming bloody murder, and we both saw the exact same thing. It was just a tall, dark shape, like a person but not a person, standing over the bed looking down at us. And we couldn't move, really, or get out of bed, or do anything except scream. And after that, we knew we had to get out of that apartment, and we didn't take very much time. I think we were gone within a couple of weeks and into a new place. We got married, lived happily ever after. That's the good part of it. But I'll never forget that night or that place. Definitely something wrong with that place. So thanks. That's our story. We love the show. We've been fans for a while now. I think we've listened to a couple 100 episodes. Keep doing what you're doing, and Take care.
And a story from Alana in the U.S. Children's Cemetery Story. This event occurred over 15 years ago, and I still get chills about it to this very day. A very little background on me first. I've always been able to sense spirits, hearing what I call white noise. I liken to a radio station that isn't fully tuned in. Lots of static and voices underneath. I was born 3.5 months early. This will be of importance for the story I'm about to share. My then boyfriend, now husband, is a lover of history and genealogy. Back then, he was doing grave rubbings of ancestors. You are able to read really old gravestones that have been made unreadable by time and weather elements. More clearly if you take rice paper and some artist chalk and transfer the dates information on the paper. As such, we were in the cemetery one day. Me not interested in what he was doing, I started to wander around. All the while, my sixth sense, the white noise I talked about earlier, kept getting louder and louder with each step I took. When I finally stopped, I looked down and found myself in the children's section of the cemetery. The white noise got louder and faster as I walked up and down the rows. Suddenly, I kept hearing, "You are me, I am you," repeated over and over. When I stopped and looked down at the grave, I saw a baby girl with the exact date of my birth, month, day, and year. Not the one that should have been 3.5 months later, as the baby's birth and death date. I'm not sure what all this means. It's the only time it has happened. I just hope that baby girl who died is smiling, and I hope I'm doing her proud and living my, or our, best life.
It's Halloween, the night he came home, when the deepest fears are made real, when the darkest nightmares come true, when the most courageous soul cowers in the face of evil. First time on TV, the modern horror classic from John Carpenter. Parental discretion advised. This film contains elements of shock and suspense. And now, Halloween, you won't be watching it alone.
A story from Christian in Donna, Texas. Haunted Texas Home. My family has been living in this home of ours for at least 10 years now, since we've moved from Michigan. It started out as a 2-bedroom home that my parents and 3 other siblings shared. Over the years, we've renovated it and kept improving on it. Despite the superficial changes, each one of my siblings and I have had strange experiences. My brother and sister have both heard a whistle originate from the living room on 2 separate occasions. They didn't know each other had experienced the whistles until there was a topic of ghosts brought up. While skeptical of my brother's account, once my sister said she experienced the same thing, I now believe him. My brother has heard disembodied voices coming from his room and believed it was either me or our sisters. So far, he's been tricked 3 for 3. Years ago, in my high school days, I watched as my cup of soda slid across the desk right before my eyes. It was 3 in the morning, and thus I thought maybe it was a lack of sleep that was getting to me. That was the last time I experienced something in that house, until March of this year. I woke up in the middle of the night. I couldn't move. I was lying on my stomach, slightly to the side, and turned my head. It took me a few seconds, but once my vision adjusted to the dark, I could finally see her. It was a woman, about 5 foot tall, with long, flowing black hair. Her hair was parted, but her face was entirely shrouded in darkness. My heart was racing, but I somehow managed to hold out my hand. She was pacing back and forth in front of my door in tiny strides. Then she stopped and noticed me. I kept reaching out toward her. I don't know if I actually spoke or not, but I distinctly remember asking her who she was and what she wanted, and telling her I wasn't afraid of her. All the while, she only crept closer and closer. It seemed like she was curious. She got so close that part of my hand went right through her. I kept trying to communicate with her, but she never spoke a word. She leaned forward toward my face. I lost strength in my arm and it limped down. Take note, this encounter lasted no longer than a minute. I kept communicating toward her that I wasn't afraid. All she did was wave at me and disappeared. I discussed the experience with my family, and my mother finally disclosed that the house used to belong to drug dealers and a gang leader back in the day. I honestly don't know if the woman had anything to do with that sort of history, but it certainly is a clue to the type of history this house of ours has experienced.
Hi, Lex and Anything Ghost listeners. My name is Angelica, and I'm from Denver, Colorado. I have just started listening to Anything Ghost about a couple of months ago from a friend and have fallen in love with the show and have been wanting to put in my own stories for a while now. I do have 2 stories that I'd like to share with you about some encounters that I've had with the paranormal, more like with the deceased. To start off my stories, I'd like to share some background about myself. I am first generation American and my parents are both from Mexico. So I have a heavy influence of Mexican culture that I've had growing up. As many of you guys know, like in Mexico, people there are very connected to spirits. We pay very heavy respect to our family that we've lost celebrating them with days such as Dia de los Muertos or on their birthdays as if they were still alive. Everyone tends to be big believers of spirits and ghosts, and I think that by believing, we tend to have many more experiences because of that belief. Since I was a kid, though, I've always had this weird connection with death. I know that sounds really weird, but I've always had this almost like a force that has taken me to people right before they pass. I kind of can tell and know when someone's going to die. The first story that I have was when I was about 5 years old. We were living in a house down in Denver. This house was an old house built in like the late 1800s, and it was heavy with spiritual activity. My parents, my mom especially, would feel someone sitting at the edge of the bed. We would hear dishes break, and when we'd go out and check, nothing would be amiss, everything would be okay. We would hear doors slamming, and we always had this feeling as if we were being watched or as if somebody was there. During one point while we were living in that house, my aunt came to live with us from Mexico. The reason that she came is because one of my cousins had cancer, and she couldn't get treatment out there, so she came here to see if she could get treatment and possibly save her life. Unfortunately, when they got here, the cancer had spread, and my cousin was immediately placed on hospice care. I believe she was about 11 or 12. There finally came a day where we could tell that she was actively dying. All of the parents were sitting around her bedside, just trying to spend the last few moments that they could with her. And me, my sister, and my cousins were all upstairs hanging out, kind of just waiting for it to happen. I mean, we were kids. We didn't really understand death. We were just scared of it. Cousins and sister kept trying to convince me to go downstairs and check on her since I was the youngest and see if it had happened yet. I kept saying no, and finally they gave up. At one point, though, just on my own, I decided I needed to go down there and check. So I went down, kind of snuck away from them, and went downstairs, peeked over the couch, looked at my cousin, saw her take her last few breaths, and she was gone. All the parents just started crying and hugging her, and I ran upstairs to go tell my cousins. We all just kind of sat around in the room and were crying quietly and just kind of trying to take in this big thing that kids shouldn't really have to experience. And then all of a sudden, the middle of the bed, it just began. It looked like if somebody was jumping in the middle of the bed. There was this indentation that just kept going down and back up, down and back up. We all freaked out and we got up and like kind of scurried to the corner. And we just watched it happen for a few minutes and then it was over. I never personally saw anything in that house like that again. That house, we continue to have many more experiences with it, and just like I said, it was heavy with spiritual activity, so we just kept having those same things happen over and over again, the dishes, the doors, that ominous feeling, and finally we moved out. And that's all that we really experienced there. The second story happened many years later. I was about 11 years old when this happened. My grandpa had been really sick and had just gotten back home from the hospital. He was in the ICU, really sick. He had a heart attack and he was on bed rest. So this day was on Christmas, and usually we would all spend it all together. But because my grandpa was sick, he stayed home, and my sister and I didn't go see him that day. Something that was kind of odd since we loved going and seeing him, but we just decided to stay home. We'd see him another day. The next day, which was the 26th, my dad woke up early to go to the store to buy my grandpa a new TV, since those post-Christmas sales were going on, and he really wanted him to have a bigger TV to be able to watch while he was in bed at home. And when he got home, my dad told us, he's like, I'm just going to go down there, swing and drop this off real quick and come back. And like I heard him, so I ran downstairs and put my shoes on. I was like, I wanted to go. I really wanted to go. And I go upstairs and my dad's like, no, you can't come. And I threw a fit. I wanted to go and I was going. So I just, I kept standing my ground, and eventually he just gave in. He's like, fine, you're coming with me. So, I'm happy. I go in the car, get in the car. I'm happy I'm going to go see my grandpa. And as we get in the car, my dad gets a phone call from my grandpa's girlfriend that he just got taken by an ambulance, that they think he had another heart attack. So now we're kind of, just racing time. My dad kind of is speeding to get to the hospital, and we're about a block and a half away from the hospital when my dad gets another call, and my grandpa had died. So what happened was a few years later. It'd been maybe 2 or 3 years since my grandpa passed away. Life goes on, kind of get used to someone being gone. We had this picture of him that as soon as when you walked in the door, you would kind of stare straight at it, and that's where he was. And, he'd always be greeting us when we'd get home. So one day after school, my sister and I were in the kitchen, and we were just talking, hanging out, and the door opens, and in walks in my dad. And it was one of those sunny days, when it's so bright out that you can't really see someone's face because of like the contrasting, the brightness and the darkness inside. And he kind of just walked in and walked away, and we're like, hey Dad, how are you? Nothing, no answer. And we kind of just looked at each other like, okay. We just said, he must be in a mood today, and we kind of just ignored it and then went back to talking. And we heard him go into his room. And so we're talking for a few more minutes, and then all of a sudden the door opens again, and in walks in my dad and my uncle. And my sister and I just stare at each other. We asked my dad, I was like, when did you leave, Dad? And he's like, what are you talking about? I just got here. And we tell him, we're like, no, you didn't. You came in a while ago. When did you leave? We didn't hear you leave. And my dad he's a playful guy. He's like, you guys are crazy. I just came back from, I don't know where he was at, like Colorado Springs, somewhere far. And we're like, yeah, right. We heard you come in. Stop messing around with us. And my dad's like, no, I'm serious. And we're like, we heard you. Go into your room. We run to my parents' room. We just start looking everywhere. We're looking. We're trying to find. We at this point, we think there's an intruder in the house. And we're too dumb to realize that someone's in the house. So we check all the rooms. My dad and my uncle actually end up helping us because they see how frantic we are. And we're looking around the entire house. Nobody. And finally, they think we're just messing with them. And they're like, you guys, there's nobody here. You guys are probably just tired or whatever. And, a few minutes pass and we kind of just let it go. And my dad and uncle leave again for another errand. So then we go to the living room to watch TV. We're kind of just like freaked out at this point, but what can we do? There's nothing, there's no evidence of anybody being in there. And then you hear this huge crash. And we run to the dining room to see what's going on, and my grandpa's picture's on the ground. And the frame is split. And my sister picks it up, and she's just like, I think that was my grandpa that came in the door. And we just stare there. And we just stay there staring at each other, like fear, then relief, then happiness, then sadness. Just kind of something inside of us. We knew that was him that came in. We've recounted the story to each other, to family, so many times, and it's such a clear, vivid memory. And after revisiting it, we think about how when whoever walked in the door, yes, it was sunny outside, but it was unbelievably sunny. Like, the light was almost angelic. It was so bright. That doorway was so bright. And all we saw, like I said, was a shadow. And my grandpa and my dad and all of my uncles have they're about the same height. They both have the same posture and have the same gait. They walk the same. So that's where we got confused, thinking that it was my dad. But it has been one of the most interesting and special encounters I've ever had in my life. And not only because it's a spirit of someone that I've loved, but because I experienced it with my sister and we both experienced it together. I hope that I'm able to submit more of these stories, but those are the ones that I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for listening, and take care.
And here's a story from Christine in the U.S. Scary Dream and Korean Superstitions. I had this dream when I was about 18 years old. I was walking down a narrow sidewalk in thick fog. It was so thick I couldn't see what was directly in front of me. I was walking downhill. I couldn't see what was on the left or right of me. The sidewalk was the only path forward. There was an old woman in front of me. She was wearing white clothes in the traditional style of Korean mourning. I also remember that she was incredibly short because I could see over the top of her head, and I'm not tall myself. Her hair was in a neat gray bun at the nape of her neck. She was walking slowly in front of me. I almost ran into the back of her head. I could not get around her, since I couldn't see around the path because of the fog. I'm not sure where I was going in this dream, but I remember feeling incredibly frustrated that I couldn't get around her. At one point, she stopped completely, and I heard the sound of rushing water. I couldn't see the source of the water, but I assumed it was some kind of creek or river. She was just standing there, already feeling impatient. I tapped her shoulder with my finger, and she turned around. I have never forgotten this image. Where her face should have been was an empty black hole that almost glowed because it was so black. Against all that fog, the oval black shape just petrified me. I was so startled, I opened my eyes in my bed and woke up. The dream should have been over, but directly above me on the ceiling, that same swirling mass of empty blackness was still there. The next morning I called my mom to talk about it, because the dream had startled me so badly. My mother told me that I should be thanking that faceless old woman for stopping me by the river. She told me that you should never follow someone in a dream across any boundaries, such as a wall, a street, or even a river, especially if that person is dead. She told me that they are crossing over to the other side, and that you might not wake up at all if you follow them across. And this is a story from Melina in Latvia. I think that's the first story I've ever gotten from that country. And it's called Go Home. This happened about 5 years ago. It will sound strange, but it was close to midnight, and I was alone in the woods without any light source. And let's say I had done something to end my life earlier that day. Of course, it didn't work. First of all, I want to message everyone that this action is not the answer. I encourage anyone in a similar situation to seek help. There is a way. I was on these cross grounds, lying in the grass, watching the stars above. I was really disappointed by my failure and didn't want to go home, so I decided not to. I had one more plan in mind, and it would work for sure if I stayed that night in the woods. So I was about to do that. This is when it got interesting. Up to that point, everything was calm. I had no problem with being in the dark all by myself, in the woods. But soon, I felt a presence. This feeling that I should look around. It was nagging me. So I sat up and focused my eyes on the pathway before me, from where the tension was coming. The moonlight illumined the trails enough for me to see someone standing in front of me. It was a dark hooded figure, just staring at me. I stared back at it for a minute. This was going nowhere, so I spoke to the shape in front of me. "Come and get me. I'm done with this place." I guess I thought it was death or something. The figure didn't move. It just stared. And I got a strong feeling that it was mad at me, and it wanted me to go home. I didn't care, so I lied back down on the grass, ignoring the figure. I dozed off for a few minutes. Later on, a person found me, and I had to get out of there to escape explanations at the hospital. It was not my time, and really, it is not up to us. As I was leaving, I forgot to look if the person, demon, or whatever it was still there. Now, when I look back at it, I lose my mind. Back then, because of depression, I didn't feel any fear, but now, after recovery, I do. I returned to the place a month later during the day. I thought maybe it was a fallen tree or something. I even tried looking from different angles. But no, there was nothing there that could look like that figure that I saw that night. So, what was that?
Hey, Lex, and everybody else, thanks for hearing my story out here. When I was about a year into high school or so, this was about 1997, I was playing with my friend's Ouija board at her house after she invited me over there. And we were just in her room and just two, dumb kids essentially playing around with the board. And at the time, I was pretty open-minded about it. And if anything, I wasn't necessarily a believer or a disbeliever. If something was going to happen, it was. If not, not. Then I'll go home and that'd be it. So when we were in the room, we got the Ouija board out and immediately went into town chanting like idiots and doing all kinds of movie stuff to get spirits to communicate with us. So without saying anything really weird or anything, we got a lot of weird, benign contacts that I didn't really believe at the time until one of them really proved themselves. We asked it to, quote unquote, give us a sign, kind of like how they do in the movies. And not a split second later, her hamster that was in like kind of this little metal cage in the back slams into the side of the cage and seemed to be startled as it recovered and was kind of running around the cage and kind of going under the shavings and popping back up, looking around. And this was all happening like it was in danger, like as if a hawk or something was flying above. And I figured it was just a coincidence. And since we have train tracks that go right near there, so anyway, we opened the board again when we went outside, and so she brings out this pencil and paper. And after a few questions, I needed more proof, so I told the spirit, okay, how about you just write your name? I'll hold the pencil and I'll close my eyes and whatever. So I closed my eyes, I turned my head up, and to my great surprise and shock, the letters ZOZO was written on the paper. And at first I was like, okay, that now I'm starting to get a little bit less skeptical here. And the weird thing about this is that I've never heard that name before in my life at the time, and I hadn't really known what was going on, so I just figured, it was just some kind of weird latent muscle spasms or something like that. I also just thought it could be some kind of subconscious thing going on, and I assumed maybe that ghosts just communicate through noisy channels. And then years later, this is actually in about 3 years ago from today, about 2015. I had talked to my longtime friend about this experience, and we reminisced about it. So I decided to Google Ouija ZOZO, and of course the correct spelling of it came up as Ouija or Ouija ZOZO as the first result. So I was like, okay. So I clicked on it, and I have to admit that as a grown man, I do not get scared easily. But seeing the sheer amount of people who experienced contact with this entity sent the most absolute dense goosebumps through my skin that could ever be possible. I mean, this series of very uncoordinated, temporally spaced out, and geographically separated events was just way too precise to be a coincidence or some kind of like a mass hallucination. And another thing is, like, back in '97, we barely had AOL, and if we can get it to work, my mom would be mad and kind of run up the stairs saying, "Hey, why are you guys making the phone screech like that?" Because the modems back in the day would do that before they were digital, like kind of how we have today. And anytime I tell people this story, I really could not care less if they believe or not, because I know it happened, and I don't know why it happened. I don't know like the cause of it or anything like that. But there's just way too many pieces in line. And I couldn't have heard it about it on the internet back in the day because we kind of didn't really have it. It wasn't fast enough. We didn't really have Google. I mean, AOL could kind of bring keywords and stuff up, but it's not like you could really Google something like that, or they had message boards. And I mean, this is when I was barely getting into high school there, and it was just super weird. So I thought you guys might want to hear that, and take care.
A story from Tyler in Mooresville, Indiana. Country Road Shadow Figure. This event happened 10 to 11 years ago on a dark night in October. I lived in Mooresville, Indiana, and still do, a small town just southwest of Indianapolis. I was 17 or 18, and I was driving to my girlfriend's house, now my wife, on some country roads. We lived about 10 minutes apart, I in a newer neighborhood on the edge of town, and her in a very spread-out neighborhood in the country. There was a segment of road between our houses where the road dipped down through a very shallow wooded valley. There were very tall trees that loomed over the road. It was only about a half-mile stretch, but it could be very eerie on a dark night. Going from open fields to the enclosed tunnel of trees. As a result, I was always very alert when driving that segment of the road at night, due to the risk of a deer jumping out of the woods into the road. The moon in October is known for being bright, but on this night it was a new moon, and by 9 p.m. it was quite dark out. As I came through the valley and began to go up the other side, there was another car about 100 yards in front of me. So I was watching them and the area just behind them. All of a sudden, from the woods on the right, I saw a very dark silhouette of a person walk into the road, just after the car had passed. Even though it was especially dark under the trees, I could see the outline of a head, upper torso, and an arm, swinging in stride against the backdrop of the sky. It was so clear and real that I slammed on my brakes hard enough that I could feel the ABS, anti-lock braking system, kick in. At the same time, I hit my brights so I could see better, thinking that it was going to be a close call that required me to swerve. However, as soon as the brights lit up the area where the shadowy outline was, there was nothing there. The terror of thinking I was about to hit a person shifted to terror that there was some shadowy entity that had just vanished right in front of me. I dropped the transmission into second gear and floored it, getting out of there as quickly as I could. It was a few weeks before I would take that route again that night. To this day, I cannot explain what I saw. I wasn't tired. It was about 9 p.m., and I had slept in since it was Saturday. I thought maybe it was some sort of trick of the light, but the only light source was the taillights of the car in front of me. I didn't pass another vehicle either after that, so it wasn't the headlights coming from the opposite way creating odd shadows. I drove through there the next day and didn't see any odd brush or limbs overhanging the road. I could find absolutely no rational explanation for it then, nor in the years since. Like I said, it was blacker than the moonless night sky, and so realistic. I took immediate actions to avoid hitting it, because I thought it was a person walking in the road. To this day, if I drive there at night, which I occasionally still do since my in-laws live in the same house, I get more than a little nervous driving through the dark, wooded valley. And this is This is a story from Helen in California. Haunted movie. I have 6 brothers and 2 sisters. I believe to varying degrees. Some of us were born sensitive. I say that because some of us experienced paranormal events when we were younger, and we didn't realize they were paranormal events at that time. For instance, when there were only 5 of us, the youngest child died as a baby. My mother said shortly after the funeral, she and my stepfather woke to the sound of us screaming. We had a smaller house, so the kids shared a room with bunk beds. My mother said we were so hysterical and kept insisting that there was a baby crawling around the floor and crying. I have no memory of this. My daughter has apparently got her sensitivity from me. Our house isn't haunted, and it doesn't feel creepy in any way. But I think sometimes things pass through. My daughter will nap with her door open, but not when she's down for the night. She won't be the last one to bed either. My story is about something that happened to both of us at the same time. I was sitting on my bed sewing to pass the time, and I was watching a movie called House on Haunted Hill. It was the newer version that had just started airing on cable. After the roller coaster scene, my attention waned, and I only glanced at the TV now and then. My daughter came into the room and sat on the foot of my bed, and we were having a good time laughing and talking. About that time, a blonde woman with a camera was walking through a dark house, filming different locations. I know this part from a later viewing. In one room that was supposed to be empty, she saw a doctor and nurses bending over a patient on a table. She could only see this through the camera lens. My daughter and I were still yakking it up, when suddenly we both stopped dead and turned to stare at the TV screen. On the TV, the house was creepy, dark, with just enough light to see. The blonde woman kept looking through her camera lens, then raising her eyes to look around. She stopped in front of a long, dark hall. My memory of this hall was that it was wide, with an arched roof. There were doors on all sides, all closed. Standing in the far right corner, by the last door, was a figure barely visible in the shadows. It let out a low growl. If that wasn't bad enough, it started walking across the hall to the opposite door. It kept crossing the hall back and forth, but zigzagging toward the woman with each crossing. It had that herky-jerky kind of walk. It had a humanoid shape, but there was something weird about its body. Every time it crossed, it moved faster and faster. All of a sudden, it raced right up to the screen. Not just to where the camera lens could see it. I mean, this thing practically plastered its face against the television glass. My daughter and I jumped screaming and ran out of the room. My daughter was closest to the door, so she got out first. We ran all the way down the hall to my sister's room, still screaming and a little hysterical. My sister asked us what was going on. We talked all over each other trying to explain about the TV. She didn't believe us. When we got back to my room, there was a different scene playing. I changed the channel. I didn't sleep well that night. The next time the movie aired, my daughter and I made my sister sit through the part with the woman and the camera. To our amazement, not only was there no arched hallway, the thing that rushed up to the camera didn't get at all that close to the screen or even look like the one we saw. It didn't make the same sounds either. My daughter and I just looked at each other and shouted, "That's not what we saw!" My sister has had a few brushes with the paranormal herself, but she wouldn't believe us. She said we imagined it. I've looked at that part of the movie sometimes when it airs, but it always runs the way it was meant to. My daughter and I know what we saw, but we don't have an answer. How did we see a scene in a movie that wasn't there?
Hello everyone, this is Jolie from Seattle, and I would like to share a story with you about the time that I worked in an abandoned mortuary in high school back in South Dakota. It was it was like 1995. My high school boyfriend had his uncle and his partner move in from out of town into our small town in South Dakota. And their plan was to convert an abandoned mortuary in town into a multi-use building. And so they were going to live on the top floor, which was pretty great looking. They turned it into a really great space. But they needed some help converting the bottom floor of this mortuary. They were going to turn some parts of it into apartment units, and then another part was going to be used for a computer business that uncle's partner worked in computers. So they didn't really know too many people, and they were thrifty in their money, so they talked me and a couple of our high school friends into helping clean out this bottom floor, ripping up carpets, pulling down walls, and in repayment, we were going to get free computer lessons and learn about the internet. I'd never heard of the internet at that time. It was still especially new in rural South Dakota. We didn't even have computers in school. So as Halloween was kind of coming up, the partner just loved Halloween. I love Halloween. We all loved Halloween. And the building was in such disarray. Like it was pretty scary looking, honestly, inside and out. So we decided, they were going to raise some more funds for their reconstruction. So they were going to convert this bottom part of this mortuary into a haunted house exhibit for people in town. And we were all going to be a part of it. We were all going to be characters in this haunted house. I was so excited. This was just a great time for me. And so the weeks rolled by. We got a good plan down. We got a really spooky haunted house in a mortuary, no less, that had been sat abandoned the entire time I was there. Anyway, up until this point. And it was complete with like wrought iron railings and just spooky windows. And to top it all off, in the very back of the building, this huge room, cement floor, this huge room, that's where they kept the hearses. And accessible in this room also, when you walk in to the left, was the embalming room. And everything was still kind of intact. There were even coffins still there. And we just utilized them for part of our, haunted house exhibit. Like, perfect. Spooky mortuary, full embalming room with equipment still there, complete with this gigantic room full of some coffins. So we got our plan down, we have our roles, and my boyfriend was going to have the big scare at the end for everyone. He was going to sit in this room next to the embalming room, this big kind of parking area storage unit in the building. He was going to hide in a coffin, lay down on the ground, hide in the coffin. He was going to be dressed like a vampire, and he was going to have I think it was tomato sauce and spaghetti or something that he was just going to kind of throw at people as soon as they entered the room. And it was kind of a guided tour, a little bit. We just want to make sure groups kept in one, so he could get back into the coffin and throw more, and spook them some more. Now, my role was kind of coordinator. I had to make sure everybody was in their place, so I was running around quite a bit in behind the scenes. And on the opening day of our first showing of this haunted house exhibit, my boyfriend actually was pretty scared about sitting in a coffin in this room in the dark by himself. And he asked if I could kind of just keep him a little bit of company, because he's going to be sitting there waiting, at least by 10-15 minutes all by himself. Now, that doesn't sound like a tremendous lot, even when we were planning, but I tell you what, folks, it was scary. I could totally understand why he wanted someone there. So here we are. I'm sitting in this big, gigantic room, all dark. Everything, all the lights are off. There's no windows in there. And all I see is a hallway straight ahead of me that has a little bit of light to help guide people through. And I'm just and I put my boyfriend in the coffin, and I sit on it, and it's a little muffled. We can't really hear each other, so we just kind of communicate with little raps or something like that, just I'm still here, all right. This was a really terrifying experience. I underestimated how scary it was going to be sitting in that room. And then during a moment of silence, I was just waiting, and I have to keep my eye on the time to make sure I get out of there before the crowd comes. In a moment of silence, I hear what sounds like a very large, heavy box being pushed pretty quickly across the cement floor. Like somebody had just shoving a box along the floor, and it stops. Yeah, I'm pretty sure all the color drained, all the blood drained from my body at that moment. In fact, I probably had a panic. Panic has come in because I know we are the only people in that room. I know because everybody else who has access has already got other roles to do. There was no way anything could move in that room, let alone what sounds like a heavy box being pushed across the floor. And then I hear it again, and it was a longer push, as if somebody's trying to get a heavy box and they're trying to move it all by themselves, or they give it one last big shove. My heart's racing even remembering this. It sounded like it was coming from behind me, because I was sitting facing the only light straight ahead, and I kind of knock on, I don't know even where I get this courage to move, because I felt like I was frozen. I knocked on the box, and I'm like, I'm out of here, gotta go. I won no good girlfriend awards for that, just leaving him there. But I honestly did have to. I did eventually have to get going. I probably left a little bit too early. I still rack my brain to this day about what could have possibly moved, and it wasn't like something fell. It was definitely someone was pushing something along the ground behind me. Um, I still get chills right now, and my heart's racing. So I ran out, and I got the rest of the show going, and we had a great run, and everyone enjoyed it. And everyone enjoyed it so much that it's still a haunted house attraction to this day. A very big annual event. Was never converted into a computer business or apartment complex, apartment units. But yeah, so that I thought I would share this haunted or this Halloween story for the Halloween special. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I hope everyone has a great spooky Halloween. Thanks again, Lex, and take care.
And this is a story from Sammy in Houston, Texas. I just left him. I'm including breakup stories now. Just kidding. It's not a relationship story. And it goes like this. This happened on Halloween when I was little. This is really the only paranormal experience I've ever had. My dad was taking me trick-or-treating, and I was dressed up as a chameleon from Pokemon. I was getting some good candy that night, and we were almost done. To get back to my street, you have to pass by 2 houses with garages that face the street. Those houses always had the biggest candy bars, but they always liked to dress up really scary, and I was terrified of them. I had to pass them by, so I just put my head down and kept walking, really scared. One of the guys ran up to us and tried to scare me, and my heart was racing. My dad was laughing with them, as he knew our neighbors. I waited for my candy, trying to be brave, when I saw another guy running up. But this guy's costume was intense. He was a human man, but he had no skin, just muscle. I stood there and stared at him, and he walked right through my dad. That was it. I was horrified. No one else around me saw, so I bolted, leaving my dad behind. Candy be damned. I ran as fast as I could, but tripped over an exposed tree branch in a neighbor's yard, and my candy spilled out of my bucket and all over the ground. Not one to waste candy, I quickly shoveled it back into my bucket, along with the grass and dirt, and I got up and kept running. When I got home, I locked the door and checked all the windows. My mom followed me around the house, asking, "Sam, what is wrong? Where's Dad?" My dad came back later, laughing, and thinking I was merely scared of the neighbor. But I explained to my dad what had happened. Of course, neither he nor my mom believed me. I knew what I saw. I remember that figure as real as day walking toward me. I never did see that thing again. A story from Joe in Omaha, Nebraska. My story took place in Omaha, Nebraska in 2012. I was living at a house converted into apartments on North 33rd in Omaha, Nebraska. I was 21 at the time, and I had just moved into my first apartment on my own. I was ecstatic. I had my own bachelor pad. The apartment wasn't in the best condition, but that was okay with me. The floors were a little creaky. You could tell the apartment had been a quick flip, and they simply laid carpet over gapping floorboards. It even still used old wrought iron heating furnaces that were older than my grandparents'. The wood floors and stairs in the hallway were very obviously the original. The creaks and worn wood told this story all too clearly. The place was ripe for a skeptic's haunting paranoia at the right time of day. I lived in the apartment issue-free as far as I was concerned. Occasionally my imagination would get the best of me at night, and sometimes I would get myself a little worked up and a little put off by the slight creepiness caused by the silence, solitude, and dark lighting in the unit. But I never thought it to be haunted. I still don't believe it's haunted, but there was one experience I had while in my bedroom that I've never forgotten. To paint a clear picture, I need to state that the main entrance to my unit in the house was at the back of the house, but there was also another entrance into my unit through my bedroom, which was connected to the house hallway that I had described before. One morning I had opened my eyes. I was awake, but I wasn't moving. I was stuck. I was lying on my back and looking around my room while I wondered why I wasn't able to move. This is when I began to notice a black apparition entered my field of vision to my right. This shook me very deeply. I wanted to get up. I wanted to yell. I wanted to say something, anything at all. I was stuck as I watched the apparition slowly move along the side of my bed toward the foot of it. After what felt like minutes of watching this, I finally felt as if I was able to regain control of my body and voice. In what must have been a very panicked and dreary delivery, I yelled, "What are you doing? Get out!" The apparition very quickly and almost instantly glided alongside the rest of my bed and around the foot of it. It stopped in front of the window and looked as if it was opening the window. Then it promptly disappeared. After this, I was fully awake and still a bit shaken by the experience. I checked the window, but found it to be shut and still locked. While it did bother me a bit longer after that, I eventually chalked it up to being an instance of sleep paralysis. After that, I never really had another experience. There had been one time in the room in which I had a dream that was so vivid and took place in the bedroom as well, that I swore it was real and actually happened until after I woke. What made my experiences a little more interesting afterwards, though, was that I learned from my friend's father, who had owned a house in the neighborhood for over 40 years now, that the house I was living in was actually one of the oldest buildings in the neighborhood. This was the case because there had been a tornado outbreak in 1913 that devastated most of the neighborhood. Much of it had been destroyed or heavily damaged, and killing about 130 people. The house I was living in, built in 1900, was still standing after the storm. I've never uncovered much history of the house beyond that, though. Amy in Illinois. An urgent message from my uncle. My parents bought our first home approximately in 1994. It was a traditional 2-story narrow house with a basement and attic. When we moved in, there was a family living on the first floor of the house and another in the basement. We moved into the second floor. For many years, the house itself frightened me, especially the basement and attic. And although I never experienced anything paranormal, I'd always have an uneasy feeling all around the house. The original family that lived on the first floor moved out, and another one shortly afterward moved in. The couple had a young girl, about my younger sister's age, and my sister would tell me that her new friend would tell her stories of the cabinets opening in the middle of the night, mugs being thrown around in the kitchen. I'd always dismiss it as young girls trying to get attention, and never took any interest in them, and never mentioned it to my parents. Fast forward a few years. I was out of high school and was working full-time. I must mention that I always hated coming home to an empty house because it would be dark, and the thought of walking by myself when it was dark would just terrify me. Except one evening. I came home to a dark, empty house, and I had the utmost feeling of peace. The house seemed quiet, very quiet. I couldn't understand why I was so calm, and had not an ounce of fright in me. I was okay with not turning on every single light in the house. It felt good for once. In fact, I remember my dad making comments like, "I know when Amy's home because the house is lit so much that you can see it from a mile away." I can still remember that feeling of calmness because before that day, I just dreaded being asked by one of my parents to turn off a light from a different room. I always felt as if someone was going to chase me and touch me the minute I shut off the light. But this was a different day. I didn't have that feeling anymore, and I was perfectly fine with it. When my parents got home that evening, my mom was shocked to see me in the living room with all the lights off and asked me if I was okay. I told her I was fine for some reason. I'm not scared at all. She went on to tell me that a priest and a dear friend of the family from our hometown in Mexico was in town and had stopped by for supper and had blessed the house. She said at first he said it was just a common house blessing, but when he finished, he mentioned that he did a small exorcism on the house. I felt my eyes were going to come out of my face, and I yelled out, "You see, I knew there was something in this house, and he knew too." Many more years went by, and the calm remained in all of us and the house, thank goodness. Fast forward, maybe 5 years. Out of nowhere, I started to get the feeling that someone was watching me from outside of the kitchen door. As they were standing on the porch looking through the glass part of the door at me. Never walking into the kitchen, just standing there, looking. I also had the same feeling at the archway entry in the living room. This went on for some time, until it hit me, and I knew it was my uncle who had passed away some years past. He was one of my mom's brothers. They were very close all their lives. He even lived with us for some time. I can't explain why I knew it was him, but I just did. So one day I decided to tell my mom what had been going on, and that I knew who it was. Once I told her, she said, "Maybe he has a message for you. Maybe just listen to him." I still remembered the puzzled look I gave her, and I said, "He's dead, Mom. I don't want to talk to him. He's dead." She suggested for me to mentally ask him to come into my dream and tell me whatever he wanted to say to me next time I had that feeling. So I did. A few weeks went by, and while I was sleeping one evening, I was lying on my right side facing the bedroom door. I awoke with the biggest feeling that my uncle was standing right in front of me. I couldn't bear to open my eyes. I remember lying there shaking out of fear. I clenched my eyes and covered myself with my blanket all the way to my head. I don't know how long it was until I finally fell asleep again. In the morning I recalled the incident, but shrugged it off as a dream. I did my usual routine before going to work. I went to shower, and that's when I noticed that I had what looked like an imprint of 3 fingers above my left shoulder blade. The fingerprints were indented in my skin, textured, and about 4 or 5 shades darker than my skin. When I got back from work, both my mom and dad were home. I immediately told them what had happened the night before. My dad, who was a total skeptic, just listened attentively. When I showed them the imprints, my mom immediately went to touch me and said, "You must have gotten burned." Nothing happened after that, but the imprints lingered for many months without fading. I had no more feelings of being watched. Fast forward several months. and my mom started to not feel so well. A few weeks went by, and after several doctor visits, we found out my mom had pancreatic and liver cancer. It consumed her in 3 months, and we lost her. To this day, I regret not being brave enough to hear what my uncle had to say. Maybe he was trying to warn us about my mom's illness, to take her to the doctor. I don't know. But it's hard for me to relay this story without feeling a sense of guilt, even after all these years. May they both rest in peace and continue to watch over our family. Carrie in New Mexico. The Adobe House. For 6 years, I lived on a very old property in the Old Town area of our city. The place I lived had 2 houses built on it. The property was surrounded by an 8-foot-tall adobe wall with huge old growth trees no one can see in and no one can see out. The adobe house I called home was built in 1832. The house was hardly standing when I moved in. It was in its original form, and very little work had been done to repair years of wear and tear. The house was 187 years old at the time we were moving out. The only heat source was a wood-burning stove. When first built, the small house was occupied by multiple residents at the same time. The Santa Fe railroad workers and their families called it home as they built the railroad. At one time, the adobe house served as a mercantile for the railroad. Twice in the early 1900s, it was used as a brothel for the locomotive station that was across the street. You could say I was gifted this old adobe house and the large property it sits on for a very cheap price. The affordable price was due to the fact that I shared the property with a person who lived in the house toward the front. He has been there for 20 years. The previous tenants that lived in my house before me had a dangerous life of drinking, addiction, and violence. The tenants moved from the house, and at that moment it was free for me to move in. As I was attending school and the low rent was helpful, I decided to live there and try my best to make it a home. I cleaned and blessed the house with good intentions. Once I was settled in, a neighbor came in and welcomed me into the neighborhood. She told me her family had lived across the street from this house for many generations, and that to her knowledge, I was the only single female to ever live there. She shared knowledge of births and deaths that took place over generations, and let me know in the last few decades that the house had seen some darkness and to be careful. She let me know of a fire that was started by a wood-burning stove years ago, and the tragedy that happened to the people living there. After our conversation, I looked at the walls and windows inside the house. I could see the black char marks where the fire had been. I carefully proceeded with living there, and was studious about using the wood-burning stove in the winter months. My neighbor that shared the property was a strange, lonesome man. He spent every day in a drunken stupor. He kept to himself mostly, and had an arrangement with the owner of the property to stay there, as he had no other place to call home. He told me one day that as soon as I moved in, the demons and the loud sounds calmed down. I asked him what he meant by that, and he explained that he didn't know why, but once I moved in, things got quiet, saying, "The demons that run the property at night and rattle the walls are not showing themselves now that you live here." I dismissed him as a person with an illness and went back to my studies. After a while, I started to notice an uneasy feeling and stuck energy, as if someone was standing behind me. I decided to go into the cellar underneath my house, as that was the only place I had not cleaned or smudged with sage. Upon opening the floor hatch and crawling into a dusty, darkened room, I found a pile of old animal bones, paintings, clothes, and children's toys from the turn of the century. I quickly found my way out of there and did not want to go back into that space. Strange things started to happen after that basement visit. I decided to do an energetic cleansing of the house and the grounds after a friend, who is a traditional native medicine woman, came to visit me. My friend said she could see the spirit of an old grandmother who told her that she was keeping me safe and not letting the dark entities harm me. After performing some religious ceremonies, my house felt better, and I was sleeping at night. I continued to focus on graduating and finishing school. I was looking for a new place to live. Every time I would leave to check out an apartment, something would happen to my car. It wouldn't start. Flat tires. I took the advice from a teacher, who is a master herbalist, and used an herb on the property and in the house, after which all the water pipes exploded in the front of the house, and as a result, the earth sank down and split open a bit, but my area was unharmed. The strange man living up front had the pipes repaired. Then he left the property for the first time in years and refused to stay overnight. I would only see a small light in one window once a month or so, and it was very, very late at night, and only briefly would the light stay on. A few months passed, and I found a new house to move into. The house I found was newly built and had plenty of windows, and I had great neighbors. Once I found my new home, it was going to be a few months before I could start moving in. The current tenant at the time was in the middle of a lease. I decided to go for it and give the new landlord my deposit. Before meeting her that day, I received a phone call from the new landlord. She said, "I'm not sure you still want to move in," and told me that the current tenant had just died in the house. I gave my condolences, but I let her know that I was still interested. I'm lucky I made it out of that old adobe place. That house still stands, but after I moved out, the water pipes exploded again, and the strange man who lived up front moved back in the day I moved out. I will not drive down that street again. Whatever is there, my mom and I told it to stay and that it cannot follow me.
Hey, this is Sarah. I live on Signal Mountain in Tennessee. I live in an area of town near the bluff where people would build their second homes before there was AC, and they would come up the mountain in the summer to get away from the heat. And I started having experiences here pretty much as soon as I moved in. It started upstairs. I just got a really creepy vibe. There's no AC up there. There's three rooms and a bathroom, and one night I got shoved awake really violently, and I thought my husband was waking me up. He was my boyfriend at the time. I was like, he's waking me up. We have to get out of the house. Something's really wrong. And I open my eyes, and he's asleep right in front of me, and I immediately think someone is in the house and is attacking me, basically. And I turn around, and nobody was there. So then a lot of little things happened. I eventually got so uncomfortable, I made a solid effort and got the downstairs rooms like renovated enough to move in. You would also hear footsteps. I would get woken up in the night because I could hear footsteps coming from that upstairs room, which is directly above the room we sleep in. Heavy footsteps a lot of the time. And definitely there was 2 times where I was woken up to those footsteps, and I turned around to look for my husband. He wasn't in bed. So I was like, oh, my husband's waking me up. He's up there stomping around. And I get up to go and confront him about it, or, tell him that he's like, ask him why he's awake or whatever. And he's asleep in the living room. I never really, we had other, little stuff that would happen. And then I had this experience where that was really odd, but I was sleeping in bed, and I had listened to this podcast, which I don't do all the time because I am easily a little bit nervous, and I do kind of think the more I talk about stuff, the more I maybe invite stuff to happen. So I had been listening to it, and I had heard like a recording of a ghost. I can't remember what that's called. And it really freaked me out. And I was like, I can't listen to this again for a while. And I went to bed, and I woke up in the night, and I was a little scared, and I wasn't sure why. And I looked at the clock, and it said 2:34, and I was like, why did I wake up? And I smelled this really strong smell of really delicious pot roast. And I was like, okay, my husband must have put something in the crock pot. Sometimes he'll do that, and every time he does that overnight, it burns. So I really need to get up and turn the crock pot off. I didn't do it. I went back to sleep. I had looked at the clock, and it said 2:34. I think it was 2:34, and I went back to sleep, and I woke up, and it felt like at least 20 minutes, it felt like had elapsed, and I looked at the clock again, and it said 2:34 again, and I smelled the pot roast really strongly again, because it said 2:34 the last time. I'm just going to go back to sleep. And so I went back to sleep, and then I woke up again, and I smell the pot roast, and I'm actually waking up because I'm slightly afraid. And I look at the clock, and it says it's 2:34 again. And I'm like, okay, this is so creepy. And I'm like, I'm just going to get up, and I'm going to go turn the crock pot off. And I get up, and I walk into the kitchen, and it smells like overwhelmingly like someone has made this amazing meal of like a pot roast, and nothing is cooking in the kitchen. And I didn't know what to do, so I got back in bed and tried to go back to sleep. And then I woke up a little bit later and looked at the clock, and it said it was 2:34 again. And so then I just was like, this is too creepy. I need to go and check on my child. I was feeling really confused. I was like, do I bring my child in the bed with me? Like, I am feeling like something's going on. And I still smell this pot roast. And it was really freaky. So I head over towards his room through the living room, and I start hearing what sounds like little whispering, like coming from across the room. And I was like, no, this is not happening. And then I suddenly hear the sound music, the intro music to your podcast. And it's a creepy it's creepy, and it's like really, really like faint. And then I looked down at my phone, which I had been using as a flashlight, and I realized that I somehow had, I guess, pressed play on my podcast app somehow, and it was playing through my phone into my wireless headphones that were across the way, across the living room. So it had been playing your podcast, which it freaked me out, but I was like, okay, that makes more sense. But I just like went straight back to sleep. And then I woke up at 5 to go and teach a 6 a.m. yoga class. And I just like jumped out of bed and was like, I'm so glad to get out of here. And I got my stuff on and I ran to the car and got in the car and I turned the car on and my clock on my car said 2:34. And I just peeled out of there and left. So then I've had these other weird things like the first year that my second child was born, he had to sleep in the room with me because he had a pulmonary condition, and I was worried he was gonna stop breathing in the night. So he slept in the room with me, but he sounded like Darth Vader every night. So my husband moved back upstairs during that first year. So he was upstairs. I could hear everything that my husband did up there. I could hear him roll over in bed. I could hear him walk across the room and to go to the bathroom. And so there was this one morning where I had just gotten the kids up and we were all just kind of resting on a Saturday in my bed. And we could hear my husband roll out of bed and we're all like looking at the ceiling and like step down and like stomp, 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 like really loudly to the door, slam that door. And I'm like, oh, that is so excessive. And very heavily walk down the steps. And we're all kind of like, oh, and I go, oh, Daddy's coming. And he's like, yeah, Daddy's coming. We're all waiting for him to walk in. We all heard him. And then I suddenly realized that he was in Colorado that week.
Here we go is a story from Akale in Colorado. Black Eyes. I was raised in the Rocky Mountains, in a small town in northern Colorado, where the heritage of the Wild West is thick. From gold mines and saloons to ranches and medicine trees, everything has a story. On the very edge of town sat a large 800-acre cattle ranch. In need of some extra cash, the ranch had decided to sell off a few parcels of land. My parents seized the opportunity to purchase one of these beautiful lots and built their dream home on top of a hill overlooking the valley. The home had 3 levels. My parents' bedroom was on the top floor. This level of the house was open with lots of windows that let in plenty of light and fresh air. My brother and I had bedrooms in the basement, which was dark, closed off, and stale. Whenever I had to make a trip up the stairs to the main level, I would scramble up those stairs as fast as I could, feeling as though I was being chased by something sinister. The return trip was often a solemn affair as I marched back downstairs into the dark hallway at the bottom. Because the basement made me so uneasy, I'd often ask my parents if I could move into the guest bedroom upstairs. The answer was always no. One night when I was around 6 years old, I was suddenly awakened from a deep sleep. I rolled onto my side and opened my bleary eyes to see my mother standing beside my bed. "Mommy?" I asked, confused. My mom had never before come into my room to watch me sleep. She continued to stare at me, silent. Assuming she needed something, I sat up. "Mommy?" I asked again, but there was no answer. Inspecting her more closely, I saw that her eyes were black. Why wasn't she answering me? Tentatively, I reached out to touch her. When I did, her form fell apart like a cloud of smoke. Already frightened, I chose not to make the terrifying trip up the 4 flights of stairs necessary to reach my parents' bedroom. I pulled the covers over my head and did not fall asleep again until the early rays of sunlight had begun to peek over the mountaintops. I started my day not long after and put the incident out of my mind. The following night it happened again. This time, I awoke to find the figure of my father standing at the foot of my bed. He stood still as stone, watching me, without saying a word. And just like before, his eyes were black. The encounter proceeded much the same as the previous had. I called out to him several times. When he did not respond, I slowly crawled toward the foot of the bed, reached out to touch him. When my hand came into contact with what should have been his body, he evaporated. In the morning, I told my parents what had happened, and that I was not going to sleep in the basement anymore. I'm not sure if they believed me or not, if they thought my experience was the typical nightmare of a child. Whatever the case, they relented, and all of my belongings were moved into the guest room. For many years, I continued to experience strange occurrences in that house. There were times when I was home alone, and I could hear disembodied footsteps of someone walking down the hallway on the middle floor. I even witnessed objects moving around all on their own. But I never saw the black-eyed doppelgangers again. We sold the house in 2006, but it's still there, sitting atop the hill next to the old ranch that was built in the late 1800s. I haven't been back in years, but I often find myself wondering if the current owners have experienced anything strange. And here's a short story from Ariane in Pittsfield, Maine. Footsteps on a long, dark road. I was walking with my best friend that came from New Hampshire. She and I were walking down a long, dark road, and I kept hearing footsteps walking behind me. Not just our footsteps, but something else. I felt like I was being watched, so I kept using the flashlight to look behind, but nobody was there. Pitch black darkness. I told my boyfriend later that night on text, and he said to stick with each other and never leave each other's sides.
Hello, Lex. Hello, listeners. My name is Randy, and I was born, raised, and still reside in the town of Valley Stream, New York. A small suburb right outside the New York City limits. My story is called The Doppelganger. I was 18 in the fall of 1983. I worked at a local supermarket, which was about a mile walk from my house. I worked in a butcher department on the night shift, cleaning up the equipment to make sure it was ready for the next shift on the next day. My girlfriend, who would later become my wife, worked at a local mall, which was about a mile in the opposite direction. She worked at a bakery, and her job was pretty much the same as mine. She worked the night shift. She would close up, clean up, make sure the equipment was ready to go the next day. We didn't see much of each other during the week, even though we had just been dating for a little under a year, madly in love, and couldn't stand to be away from each other. But that's teenage love. One night, I was leaving work, and as always, walked across the parking lot with some friends as they walked to their cars to begin their drive home, and me walking towards the main road to begin my walk home. At the corner of the shopping complex before the main road, I caught sight of my girlfriend. I was sure it was her. I could see her face. We were less than 100 yards apart. Her hair, her body shape, the things you just don't mistake, especially when you're that young and that much in love. She had a blank stare in her face, and as I walked towards her, I was like, why is she at work? What is she doing here? For her to come to where I was working at the time would have been a 2-mile walk for her. At 10 o'clock at night on a weeknight, that was very unlikely, and I thought maybe something was wrong. Well, as I got closer, I called her name, but I got no response. I called it again. Still no response. Now as I was becoming concerned and disturbed. As I got within 50 feet of her, she turned and ran. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know if there was something she was upset with me about, if there was something wrong, if she was scared, or I just could not explain it. But I had to know, and I took off instantly in a run after her. Now, when she left the spot I saw her at, she had to run sort of around the corner of a building, which has obstructed my line of sight, to get to the main road. By the time I made it to that corner, she was already out of my sight. Another 50 feet of my running brought me to the main road, and when I got there, she was already a block ahead of me. My girlfriend, wife, was not that fast at any time in her life. Now, myself, I was in my prime physical condition. There were few people at that time who could match my speed in a sprint. I took off after her, determined to catch her. I figured I would catch with her maybe a quarter of the way home towards my house. I was mistaken. For every block I gained, she gained a block and a half. I couldn't believe it. I never ran that fast in my life. I could feel the wind in my face. I could feel the tears breaking from my eyes in the night air. I noticed something and didn't think about it at the time of the incident, but the way she ran, it was almost like she was gliding. Her body was in full motion, but it was more like a stride than a full-out run. And when you cross the street, you naturally have a step down for a curb and a little step up for a curb. I didn't see that break in her rhythm. Needless to say, by the halfway point, we had evened out our distance. I would cover a block, she would cover a block and a half. My lungs were on fire, my legs felt like they were going to fall off. By the time we caught sight of my house, which is, say, at the 3/4 mile mark, I couldn't move anymore. I had to stop. I had never ran that fast, that far in a single sprint before, and I could feel it. It was late at night. I slowed down to a jog. She was still going full speed. Past my house, she was still going full speed. A 1/4 mile past my house in the direction she was heading is a intersection which has a village park on one side with a pond, a stream on the other side of the main road I live on, and some woods. These woods would head directly to her apartment complex where she lived at the time, right across the street from the mall I described earlier in the story. I was waiting for her to break across the street and head for those woods. She didn't. Then I thought she might be seeking cover in the pond, at the park, by the pond, I mean. She didn't. She kept straight running up the road, which went nowhere but to the intersection of another major highway with really nothing of interest beyond that. As I got to the gate of my yard, staring up, I had lost sight of her. I was out of breath, in pain. I couldn't help but wonder, why would she come that distance to see me? Why would she take off? Why would she not go towards home? It couldn't have been a stranger, because why would a stranger come that far either for no attractions whatsoever at the shopping plaza where I worked? Nothing made sense to me. I sat down on my front steps and thought it out for a few minutes. I don't know what had just happened. I didn't suspect anything supernatural or paranormal at the time. But I went inside and I just had to know. At this time we're dating, you didn't want to disturb somebody's family. So if we wanted to speak to each other on the phones at night, in an age before cell phones, we would dial the house of the other person, let it ring once, and hang up. Usually either my girlfriend or myself would pick up the ring and we would call back. I left my one ring and I sat by the phone for a few minutes. The phone rang, I picked it up, and on the other end, my girlfriend, in a very groggy voice, asked me what was wrong. And I responded, "What do you mean, what is wrong? Why did you run from me?" And she said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, I just chased you down Mill Road for almost a mile, and somehow you outran me and you took off. I know it was you. I saw your face." She says, "I've been in bed for the past 20 minutes. I was just falling asleep when I heard the phone ring." I didn't press it any further. It's late at night. She can't talk loud without disturbing her parents, and I didn't want to disturb mine. So I dropped it and hung up the phone. I went back out of the house again, walked to the gate, and stared down the road where I had just chased something, as it was now developing in my mind to be. Not someone, but something. Because now I started working it out. Nobody could have outdistanced me by that distance at that time. Especially not a girl who ran exactly like my girlfriend did. With her same body build, her same makeup. It just wasn't possible. And the way she ran, the strides, that kind of stride wouldn't have generated that kind of speed. What had I just seen? I was sure it was her. None of this made sense. It wasn't the first time I had a paranormal experience. But paranormal experiences, even when I experienced them, was not something I gave a lot of thought to, and it wasn't something that was on my mind at any constant time in my life. It was a shock to me. Nothing of the sort ever happened between us again, to this day. But out of all the experiences I've had in my life, that one still ranks as one of the creepiest. And I hope to never experience something like that again. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed my story, and I hope to be back with some other stories of my experiences in the future. Until then, take care.
Part 1 of An Anything Ghost Halloween has come to an end. For the final hour of An Anything Ghost Halloween, please download Part 2.